Welcome to WeTalk. This is another special episode, The Ethics of Protest, and we're celebrating the women filmmakers that are premiering their films here at this festival. So every panel is organized around one or two films directed by women that are bowing here at Tribeca 2018. In WeTalk fashion, the concept of the show is to bring together incredible women who are shaping our culture and changing the way that we live. And we want to thank our partner Dell for supporting these incredibly important conversations and providing the technologies that allows filmmakers like myself and some other ones up here and women creators of all kinds to do their thing. And also the Roxy Cinema Hotel is such a special haven for women and for artists of all kinds. I'm going to introduce our panelists. Nancy on the far end, who I absolutely adore, is an award-winning, very accomplished filmmaker, director, producer, and media strategist. She's actually going to be on another panel today because she started an app. She started a company that started the most widely used and effective nonviolence app in America, Circle of Six. But for now, we're going to focus on your filmmaking. Roll Red Roll, which premiered here and is buzzing big time, is an incredible film that takes a deeper look into the headlines of a notorious high school sexual assault to witness the social media fueled boys will be boys culture that let it happen and swept it under the rug. As a globally recognized human rights activist, her work focuses on creating impact around the prevention and transformation of gender-based violence. She serves on the Biden Foundation Advisory Council for Violence Against Women. She was an impact producer for the Academy Award-nominated documentary The Invisible War and for Girl Model, and also directed The Line, a personal documentary which explores sexual boundaries and looks at the nuanced idea of the line of consent. The film came from Nancy's own experience with sexual assault, and she hopes it can serve as a tool to start the conversation. In her TED Talk, Nancy mentions that talking about it became her vehicle out, and that the camera allowed her to tell a bigger story, which she continues to do.
You do dig around on Wikipedia. I was like deep in the weeds.
You know what? I've been on. The thing is, as a talk show host on the side and a filmmaker myself, I've just been on enough things that, you know, where it's not well researched and it bothers me. So anyway, Roll Red Roll looks at how an amateur crime blogger, Alex Goddard, uncovers disturbing evidence on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter documenting the assault of a teenage girl by members of a beloved high school team in a small town in Ohio, and questions linger about the collusion of teen and adult bystanders. I cannot recommend this film enough, and I don't really have to. I have a trailer, so let's just look at that.
There's pressure to get these kids guilty. Even if they're guilty, they'll blame that they didn't do this and that. I hope, you know, that the truth comes out.
When I first read this story, there wasn't a lot of substance to the article. 2 high school football players had been charged, just a couple of paragraphs about these 2 boys, and that was it. I thought, this is nuts because that town is so entrenched in their football team. This is big news. So that's when I started snooping around.
I had never seen a case constructed like this. That many people who have some information.
This was a sexual assault with teenagers, and the cell phones told the story. We had photos. We had 400,000 text messages.
It was on Twitter, actually. Song of the night, rape me. Some people deserve to be peed on. Just the complete lack of empathy. That was what was so frightening. I mean, it was all out there.
You're always going to get 2 very different sides, but this was just at another level. We didn't know exactly what happened, but we knew there was a lot of defensiveness about it.
I just didn't understand it at all because I don't think it's something that doesn't occur in other cities and states and counties all over.
If teachers knew about it, if coaches knew about it, if a principal knew about it, if parents knew about it, why was nothing done about that? The question was, is this football town, putting its daughters at risk by protecting its sons in a situation like this?
What strikes me about the film also is just how we live in public and at this point, and how these kids unabashedly hung themselves on social media, and then because of the internet and because of anonymous, right? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's shocking for us now and being steeped in technology and someone who's familiar with tech, it's like stunning that people thought, I'm going to tweet about this and it's just between me and my 10 friends, or this YouTube video I'm going to post laughing about a sexual assault. Well, it's just for my 12 buddies who are going to see it. It's on YouTube, right? So the thing that's amazing about Alex Goddard, who sort of leads us through the whole story, is Alex, amateur crime blogger, but also social media consultant, knows how to find deleted stuff, knows how to dig back into archive. And she found all of this material. It was like this perfect storm that Alex started snooping around, because what she found was so horrendous. And they all thought, well, I put it out there, but now it's gone. And it's sort of, Anonymous would say the internet never forgets, right? And so Anonymous picked up the story and made it viral, and it's just this amazing sort of fun house where social media is the problem, but also can be part of the solution. And
then she came under fire.
Absolutely.
But from established people in the town.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just for being someone who sussed this out.
Yep, she found it. She's a woman. She's snooping around. She's putting her, this is out there. This is cultural. We need to look at it. And people tried to silence her. And actually, her blog was a forum for townspeople to say, we don't agree with this. There's always been this bullying culture. This happened to my daughter. This happened to me 20 years ago. Locals were saying that kind of stuff and posting anonymously. And the lawsuit was to try to force Alex to identify them and reveal their information. So there's something about being in a small town and not having the freedom to actually go against the status quo. And that's what we're trying to do with the film. It's like a whole cultural problem that's 360 degrees. It's a whole community.
Yeah, I mean, the film in and of itself is a vehicle for protest, And before we move on to introducing other guests, just one more question. In terms of your own personal experience, what resonated with you in making this? Because you went through it yourself.
I mean, what really inspired me was women calling this out. Alex called it out. This is wrong. She's intervening the way no one intervened in that town. She's intervening from afar using what she can do, which is the internet, her smarts, and a blog. Rachel picks it up. Rachel's a reporter from the Plain Dealer in Cleveland. Rachel picks it up, takes this woman seriously, and says, I'm going to keep looking. New York Times picks it up. So it's like this kind of stepping stone. Prosecutor is a woman who takes it really seriously. There's just this way that women kind of all supported each other and amplified each other to create all the noise and all the change.
Yeah, and it was that typical thing of where is that line of consent, and she was partying and she was drunk, and
right.
Is she responsible?
Right.
Which I think is something that we should return back to. But let's move on to Jennifer. Jennifer Cooper serves as the UN Women Coordinator at the Unstereotype Alliance, a global alliance set to banish stereotypical portrayals of gender in advertising and all brand-led content. And you've worked at UN Women for more than 15 years. Mm-hmm. And we met pretty recently because we have Panama in common. Yeah. And you ran the regional office from 2013 to 2017 in Panama, which I have a very deep love for because of my series Jungletown. And as a partnership specialist during that time, led outreach efforts to build relations with non-traditional partners, including through UN Women's engagement during the Summer Olympic Games in Rio and its legacy program aimed at engaging the private sector to achieve gender equality in sport. UN Women is developing partnerships with more and more sports organizations, including Women Win, which I'm not sure what that is. But tell us what, I thought the sports connection was interesting also. Tell us about that. Let's start with that.
Pleasure. So for those who are not familiar with UN Women, we are the United Nations organization that represents women's rights and pushes for gender equality and the empowerment of women globally. We're present in 90 countries, and our headquarters is here in New York. And I think, when I was thinking about the power of protest, the ethics of protest, one of the most interesting movements of late that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in is, as you were saying, this involvement of what we would consider to be non-traditional partners. UN Women was born from the women's movement all around the world. Women in Nepal, women in Kenya, women in Paraguay, women in Bolivia, organized with their governments and asked us if we could, asked their governments, create a body in the UN that will represent us. Give us a voice so we can talk to power. So that's what those are our roots. And so now as we've expanded, and now that there's this moment of Me Too and Time's Up, I mean, right now I've never seen such a ripe time for making change happen. And so we're reaching out to corporations, to media, to sports, to Olympics, et cetera, to bring them into not only this conversation, but into action. And for me, I would say that the most important lesson in terms of the ethics of protest would be that in order for us to make the kind of change happen that we want to see, we do have to help others to set aside competition and to move into collaboration. And that's, I think, where UN Women has a strength, and where I'm seeing us moving into spaces where, with messaging where we've never been before. And that also includes internationally.
Tell us about 2 roads, 1 goal.
Yeah, 2 roads, 1 goal really is about sort of 2 different strategies for making change happen. And I think that also links back to us looking for partners. We could go the traditional route where we have tended to work in the space of law and policy. We work on these areas, violence against women, huge. 1 in 3 women will experience violence around the world. We've made huge inroads into changing laws and policies around the world to create this kind of environment that protects rights by law. But then we have a bigger challenge, which is once those laws are on the paper, how does that affect change in real lives? So at the heart of what we need to change, and where we're driving now in partnership with organizations like media organizations, like changing advertising through the Unstereotype Alliance, with the power of some of the most important brands in the world, as well as the advertising agencies. When we get them to commit to removing stereotypes and also, on more positively, putting up positive portrayals of women and men, then we can make the change happen at a cultural level where the attitudes begin to shift, and then we see the behaviors begin to shift. Because without those changes, those laws and policies in many, many places will simply remain on paper, and women and others will go without justice in their day-to-day lives. And we're not going to see the change in the violence, et cetera, that becomes the tool of force to enforce what I guess we could call the patriarchy, which is still very much alive and well, unfortunately.
Yeah. And Rabbi Rachel Timoner, to your right, has been very instrumental both on the left coast, what I call the best coast, where you used to be a rabbi, and now as senior rabbi of the congregation Beth Elohim in Park Slope, Brooklyn, where her passions are social justice, spiritual life, community building, and lifelong learning. Rachel has launched several community organizing and social justice initiatives at CBE, including Dismantling Racism Community Organizing Team, in partnership with the New York City Council member Brad Lander, hashtag GetOrganizedBK, through which thousands of New Yorkers work together to defend democracy and human dignity since 2016, a very fateful year. And then in California, very much an instrumental leader in Reform California, which had major statewide victories in immigration rights, affordable housing, and police reform. And behind you, you were being arrested.
Yes.
Pretty recent, not that long ago, but you were supposed to be on CNN that night, and instead you were led away with 19 other rabbis.
That's right.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. First of all, it's really fun being interviewed by my sister. I've never done that before. Yeah, so I'm a rabbi, and as a rabbi, my job is to represent the Jewish people in some way and lead a community around Jewish tradition and also around our deepest moral values. And in November of 2016, our country elected a president who is degrading humanity, is scapegoating populations and targeting people in ways that devalue their human dignity. And so I have felt that it was necessary at some times to put my body on the line to, along with other rabbis and other people, to say this is unacceptable. This was in February of 2017, right after the Muslim ban. And I was one of 19 rabbis who blocked a road in front of the Trump Hotel at Columbus Circle at night, and were taken away. And it was a way to just amplify our voices and say, as religious leaders, as Jewish leaders, we stand with Muslims in this country and say, our tradition teaches very, very clearly that we are not to oppress the stranger, ever. And we are to love the stranger as we love ourselves. And right now, what this president has done is tell us all that Muslims are strangers and not to be trusted. And we, as Jews, wanted to say, as rabbis, wanted to say, we don't accept that. We stand with our Muslim sisters and brothers, and we stand for human dignity and human rights.
What's happening here, Rachel?
Well, this... Are you friends with Stash Heller?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. So Stash actually organized this. I did not organize this. This was in the Capitol in D.C., and this was a group of rabbis and other Jewish leaders who went to go stand with Dreamers when there was, for a brief moment, the possibility that DACA was going to be protected in the budget negotiations. And the Dreamers were there every day. The man in the orange hat is a dreamer and was organizing hundreds of dreamers who were there every single day, lobbying and protesting and trying to defend their right to be in this country. And we as a Jewish community felt like we should show up and be with them and say, our people, we are an immigrant people. We've gone from country to country to country as Jews, and often fleeing persecution and seeking safety and well-being, and came to these shores in that kind of pursuit, just like the Dreamers, and just like the immigrants who are, again, being treated like pariahs in this country for the gain of political power, just being used. And so we went to go stand with Dreamers, and we sat down in the middle of the rotunda, and we're told to disperse and didn't disperse, and were arrested. Again. Yeah.
One quick question for you. Protest. What is the biblical or rabbinical what is the history of protest?
In the Talmud, we're taught that anyone who has the ability to protest wrongdoing in his or her family and does not is held accountable for the sins of their family. And anyone who has the ability to protest wrongdoing in their town and does not is held accountable for the sins of their town. And anyone who has the ability to protest the wrongdoing of the world and does not is held accountable for the sins of the world. We are obligated to protest when we know that there is wrongdoing and we have the ability to do something about it. And so what that means to me is, to whatever degree I have privilege, and I actually have a lot of privilege, my obligation is to use that privilege to protest injustice when I see it. And that's what the Talmud teaches us.
I'm happy to report that Rachel is Senator Schumer's rabbi, so she's influencing him and how many other families with your incredible self?
About 950 households.
Perfect. Okay. A privileged households who can go out there and do something, and are. Great. And to your right is an extraordinary woman who made one of my, I had to have two films on this panel because I couldn't choose between the two. Roll Red Roll and Say Her Name, The Life and Death of Sandra Bland is such an important film. It premieres tomorrow here, and is HBO's behind it. But before that, I was introduced to Kate's work through Traffic Stop about Breon, is that how you say it? Breon King, a 26-year-old African-American school teacher from Austin, Texas, who was stopped for a routine traffic violation that escalated into a dramatic arrest. And caught on police dash cams, King was pulled from her car by the arresting officer, repeatedly thrown to the ground and handcuffed. And en route to the jail, in a squad car, she engaged in a very revealing conversation with her escorting officer about race and law enforcement in America. And the documentary that Kate skillfully put together juxtaposes dash cam footage with scenes from King's everyday life, offering a fuller portrait of the woman caught in this unsettling encounter. Here she is, a school teacher. And what's incredible is the film that you're premiering here about Sandra Bland is another traffic violation, not putting a signal on, changing lanes. And what I found particularly poignant about this film that you directed and produced is that Sandra had a calling not very long before that to return to Texas from Chicago, particularly to fight police brutality and racism. And within days of declaring that to her family, was pulled over and arrested and then never seen again, alive. Mm-hmm. We have a clip, but do you want to say anything about what drove you to tell these two stories before we play it?
Well, I have a history, 20 years of making films that give voices to people whose stories are either overlooked or misrepresented. And sort of I'd love to peel back layers of the onion and kind of dig at a deeper truth. In Sandra Bland's case, it was, as probably many of you know, became a flashpoint for a movement. The mystery enshrouding her death as she was found hanging in her cell 3 days after this traffic violation really ignited an enormous amount of anger across the country and many, many protests. And so, because we don't know, she was not shot in the back 20 times, as equally tragic as that is for any victim of police overreach. We don't know definitively what killed her, and so her death became, to me, a bit of a litmus test for the country. It polarized people. We worked very closely with Sandra's family beginning shortly after her death and followed the case and sort of explored on a journalistic level what really happened, but also try much more emotionally to portray Sandra as a three-dimensional, extraordinary fighter that she was.
Yeah, she was so vibrant. The thing about her was she started this series called Sandy Speaks, and she calls, it was for young kids growing up in this racist world that we still all live in, to kind of navigate that, and she calls them her young kings and queens. She was bursting with life, and this is just not the profile of someone who took her own life over the weekend because of a traffic violation. She had a mission she was on, and that's what you do so well. It is literally the story of the life and death, and it's interwoven in a way that really makes a very convincing case against Officer Insinia and all of those people down there in Waller County, Texas. And now he's free, right? He's like walking around. He's fine.
Yeah, yes, no, it's really hard to indict cops. I mean, they just,
even with the dash cam and the body cam, and he pulls her physically out of the car and assaults her. On camera, you see him hit her. And then she says, I can't wait to take this to court, which is probably what ended her life.
And she was jailed, incidentally, for assaulting an officer, but that never is quite visible on any of the dash cam footage.
Let's take a look at it. Let's take a look at it.
Good afternoon, my beautiful kings and queens. It is Wednesday, April 8th, 2015. Hopefully you are out there or were out there this morning doing something productive, successful, something that is going to help establish your kingdom and queendom. Today's Sandy Speaks is going to focus directly on my white people. White people. Yes, black people know that all lives matter. But what I need you guys to understand is that being a black person in America is very, very hard. I am not a racist. I grew up in Villa Park, Illinois, was the only black girl on an all-white cheerleading squad, so I had to learn how to deal with white people. But I want the white folks to really understand out there, not all of us, but some of us are really doing as much as we can. And we can't help but get pissed off when we see situations where it's clear the black life didn't matter. Because in the news that we've seen as of late, you could stand there, surrender to the cops, and still be killed.
You know, you can't orchestrate the frustration, and you can't control the desire to see change.
Answers! We demand answers! This is the New York City Police Department. Please be advised that pedestrians are not moving. United, we stand! We're doing this for Sandra! United, we stand! We're doing this for Sandra! United, we stand! We're doing this for Sandra! Say your name! Sandra Bland! 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 Say your name! 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 Hell! Hell you talking about? 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 Hell you talking about?
Social media again, and the internet, I think, what was a woman that started to say her name, right?
Yes.
Who was that? It was just some woman who was mad, who was angry, or?
Well, it was actually about a case before Sandy's death, and then Sandra's became extremely sort of attached and is a much more well-known case. But there were rumblings before. I'm not exactly sure the first person who started it.
There's so many different kinds of protest in your film. There's Sandy's own protest, which she protests through love with her videos. And she did how many of those? Well, quite a few.
About 60.
Okay. And she was doing them every week or every?
When she was in the mood, a couple a week for about, beginning only 6 months before her death.
Rachel, I saw your sermon at Rosh Hashanah where you spoke about the ultimate protest, the ultimate way to protest the situation, and we're in right now. Do you want me to remind you?
I know.
Okay. What is it?
I mean, what I talked about was how there's so many forces in our society right now that are trying to cultivate hate, and that really the protest that we need is to love and to act and speak and relate through love. I just want to say I'm so moved that you made this film, and I hope that it leads a lot more people to know her name and to know her story and to get out into the streets for the next life that's lost, which unfortunately there will be many more.
Yeah. Ironically, as you suggest, Sandy's own words were very much about what happened to her. She was prophetic in a certain way and speaks from the grave throughout the film. And so one of her messages that I think may surprise people, I don't want to give away the film, but I will say that she was adamant that whites and blacks not stay in a kind of us versus them polarized position, and that everybody listens to each other and learns to love each other. So we try to instill that in the film so that it may start out as a murder mystery and become something else.
Overall, for all of you, does protest ever go too far? Is there ever a time and a place for violence, meeting violence with violence? And also to you, Jennifer, to kick it off, UN Women, does UN Women also get behind things like this?
UN Women, as I was saying, I mean, first of all, for one thing we'd be very, very clear on, we would never support the use of violence as a form of protest. Absolutely not. That would go against everything that we stand for the United, from the United Nations origins. And we're guided by the the Charter on Human Rights and the Charter of United Nations. So, but do we get behind protest movements? Absolutely. As I was saying, we are born out of the women's movement, and we work with women's movements, women's groups in places that can be very, very isolated, places that are in conflict. Democratic Republic of the Congo, as you all may be familiar, some years back, and it's still ongoing, horrendous levels of violence directed specifically at women. But I met a woman from the DRC who was one of the biggest inspirations as far as meeting a human being who had the capacity to forgive and the capacity for compassion. She forgave those who she saw murder members of her family, rape her, and she went back to her country, to the DRC, on a healing mission. First of all, she forgave those men, those soldiers who did that to her, and she went around to communities to ask women to do the same thing, because her logic was, if we continue with anger, we will only perpetuate the cycle of violence. We will never see an end to it. So I've seen incredible acts of courage, and compassion and forgiveness is an act of enormous courage.
On the question about is there protest that goes too far? Are there certain kinds of protests that I don't support? What I would say is, I don't support violent protests, and I don't participate in violent protests, but I think that we need to acknowledge that there is state violence and cultural violence and continual daily, hour by hour, minute by minute violence being perpetrated against people of color and poor people in this country all the time. And so it is understandable to me that people who are experiencing that feel angry and lash out. And I am not ever in a position to judge that, or I don't think that is the way to go. But I also think that we need to understand that there's a context of violence that is happening every minute of every day. And the other thing I would say about protests is that to me the most important part about protests is how to be effective. Mm-hmm. So it's really easy to get out and make a sign and chant some things, and that can become really ineffective. And so to think about how do we build the power that we need, and how do we use protest strategically to have the results that we want. And I spend a lot of time thinking about that, and a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about that.
There was Nancy, I'm going to you, but there was I read a really interesting article about a case against an arena that was a freedom of speech case where the protesters sued because they were animal rights protesters, and they couldn't get close enough. It was a Barnum and Bailey circus, and they couldn't get close enough to get people going to the circus to actually have an effective protest. And the case was upheld, like the protesters, it was a freedom of speech violation. Because in order to have an effective protest, you actually have to reach the people that you're protesting. But oftentimes, I think that happens where people are silenced and held back. In the case of Roll Red Roll, we didn't see this so much in the trailer, but there's an incredible protest that occurs, a series of protests.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to say, especially for women, I think we have to reach a place of love, but I think anger is really good. Mm-hmm. I think anger is really, really good. It's like, fuck you, gasoline. It's like where change comes from. Yes. You can't let it consume you. I realize as I get out of bed, like raging with anger, it's like, okay, I don't need to wake up like this every morning. But so often, I think, especially for women, we're told to forgive, I think, too quickly. And when I was with my first film, I interviewed the man who sexually assaulted me, and this big question came up, with a hidden camera, and I covered his face, but the question came up: what if he says he's sorry? Do I have to forgive him? What if I'm not ready? I don't know. I don't know what that means, and that was the only but now I want to, that was the only time I went to a rabbi, but now meeting you, I'm like, I want a new rabbi, but, and I said, do I have to forgive him? And the rabbi said, you don't have to forgive him. You have to feel, he has to apologize to you 3 times. Yep. You have to feel it's genuine. Then you decide if you want to. And I felt so empowered by that. I mean, he did not apologize. So I didn't have that problem. But there was something so powerful about, and forgiveness is beautiful on your own terms, but so often we're like, especially young girls, told to be good, be nice, forgive. That's right. It's like your anger is going to get you out there and get you protesting. And just one last little thing, I don't support violence in any way, but watching Richard Spencer get punched, which became an internet meme about punching a Nazi, he doesn't have a speaking tour anymore. Like, people, you know, there was enough protest against him that Boo Hill, the king of the alt-right, doesn't have these lucrative gigs anymore. And I don't, it's like this, I think there's the complexity of that conversation because it was sort of an internet prank, but he got punched in the face, and then all of a sudden, it's like, we don't have to put up with this guy, and he was humiliated, and it's actually affected Richard Spencer's reach. So there's something interesting about that. I don't support physical violence. I think it's very dangerous and negative, but something to look at there. A little more.
Yeah. Also, okay, we have you have a fan out there.
It's Mom.
It is. Yay. I just want to say one more thing about Kate's film. It's just martyrdom, you know. Throughout our history, martyrdom has been something that galvanizes people, and it's a shame. It's a shame that Sandy Bland had to lose her life to incite all those protests. But Rachel and Kate, I guess to finish this off, martyrdom throughout history, right? Starting, who's our first martyr? Who's the big famous martyr? She's like, I can't do this.
Jesus Christ.
Oh, I didn't know. Okay, I'll answer that. Joan of Arc. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I wonder, you know, let us all say the names of the martyrs that we feel should be spoken right now, and hope that there aren't too many more.
Right, and one of the sort of sad, poignant ironies of Sandy's death is that, you know, she really wanted to make a difference. That was, you know, as you said, and she is now. And so, in a, you know, one of the kind of pieces of cold comfort I can take from this story is that, you know, maybe this is how she would be deeply satisfied. I think that her story is living on. It did a lot more in her death than maybe she could have done in her life. But we shouldn't have people die. I mean, I just wanted to say in terms of the punching incident, and if I throw in Harvey Weinstein, that it also, and all protests, that it's a way to reach, to make news. Isn't that something that they all have in common, that shifts the dialogue? And it's a problem in terms of if you sit back and forgive too quickly, then there's no news story around it, and it's not going to go viral, and so.
I just want to add to that, anger is essential. And by promoting love, I don't mean to do it in contrast to anger. We need both. We need to speak and act from anger anger is the body sign, the emotional sign that a violation has happened. And we need to honor that, because it's when that arises in us, it lets us know something is not okay here. And if we brush past that or repress it, that is bad for us, and it's also bad for the world, because when violations happen, they need to be righted.
Just like to add one thing on this as well, and I want to thank the storytellers for bringing these voices, for keeping them alive, even under the worst circumstances. Another thing that we do in terms of supporting protest is try to amplify the voices of those who are very legitimately angry. We don't want to silence that at all. So I'd just like to make that very clear. So, and I also want to acknowledge that this year at the Tribeca Film Festival, the 46% of the films are directed by women, and that is significant as well. You know, that we need to have the voices of the women filmmakers out there, and it's very good to see that there's a supportive atmosphere here and that there was intention behind that to drive those numbers up so that stories like these can be brought to the screen, and these kinds of experiences get out there into the public consciousness, and they do not go away.
I will say this, to close this off, Tribeca Film Festival itself, I learned as a juror this week, was founded, I know this, and I've been a filmmaker at this festival, this is my third time, but it was founded as a protest to 9/11. So it's 17 years old this year. And Jane Rosenthal and Paula Weinstein, who founded it with Robert De Niro, founded it to say New York's not, we're downtown New York is alive and well, and we're not going anywhere. And so I think it's really apropos that they are also leading the charge with having 46% of women-directed films here. It's a historical thing. So thank you for being at WeTalk. It's been another great episode. And